So, let's talk vintage, okay? And I promise it's not just because I'm an aging, middle aged old man whose white hair is just sprouting out. I want to talk about vintage stuff. I want to talk about vintage clothes, vintage movies, vintage cars, vintage food, and vintage people, all just real quick. And so, let's talk about vintage clothes. I prefer vintage clothes for a number of different reasons. I guess the biggest reason is that I think they have they're made of a higher quality. So oftentimes I'll find single stitch T-shirts that are 100% cotton, pre-shrunk, things of this nature. And in today's world, it's hard to really know what you're getting with the clothes, I'd say, as far as the fabric, the durability, and ultimately the longevity of it. And so I'm a huge clothes guy myself, and I just really enjoy the overall experience more when I have something vintage on, for sure. And vintage movies are my thing. I have an eBay store. We try to sell a lot of VHS tapes. That's kind of been our thing in the past. VHS is a different kind of media. It's the tape, and you put it in the VCR. I like the plethora of all the titles available because VHS was the main platform for such a long time that there are a lot of cataloged titles, and I could just spend the rest of my life watching every single one of them. So I like VHS movies, and I like vintage VHS movies, and I like vintage cars. So I like vintage cars because I guess what dude doesn't, or what person doesn't, right? In terms of their durability, they're built to, withstand time and things of this nature. I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and so I'm from a part of the country where I get to see a lot of vintage cars and just a lot of vehicles in general last a long time out where I'm from because the environment and the cars doesn't they don't rust out here in the desert. So a good part about living in the desert is that your cars don't rust, and for car and gearheads out there, you'll know that that is not only 100% absolute true, but kind of gets the motor going in terms of really. I love cars so much, especially vintage ones, but I can't ever, on the East Coast, they're virtually not a thing, and in the Midwest either. That's because of the weather, and so they rust. The bodies rust, parts go, and it makes it unfixable. Rust is something that cannot be fixed. It's the eating of the steel, and so yeah, I like vintage cars, and only I guess specifically because I'm from where I'm from, and I get to see vehicles out on the road and have my whole life with no rust. And make a trip out onto the East Coast during a winter storm, right, and just see all of the rusty cars around everywhere. It's a nightmare, but something that can't be avoided because of the environment. So I also like vintage food. Now, what do I mean by vintage food? I mean that the whole fad with ancient grains and whole foods and just putting it into simple terms. If your grandparents didn't eat it, then it probably is not the best for you now. So, with processed foods and stuff, if your grandparents didn't eat it, then it's probably something that's either going to not be good for you or that you need to really look into in terms of processed foods, ultra processed foods, things like that. Whereas back in the day, there was really very little processed foods, and I'd argue even probably zero ultra processed foods. And if there were, they were very small in their amount. And so there's that. Now, vintage people. So here's the thing. All right, if you're watching this video and you're obviously we're grown adults, but the thing is dating people and having specific preferences, I'd say, with certain kinds of groups of people. And I would say that both like in the physical sense and in like the friendship sense, I prefer, or I have preferred recently in my life, maybe the last 5 years or so, older people, whether it be friends or my lady that I'm seeing or whatever. Point in fact, the last woman I was with was the 22 years older than me, one or whatever, older than my parents. And so, yeah, it's so weird. I guess like we can't help what we're attracted to, I'd say one, and two, um, I have always enjoyed, I'd say, more or less just, an equivalency to my own peer group, but hanging out with people that are a little bit older than me and sometimes a lot older than me has sometimes been um, the most beneficial as far as growth and learning goes on my end of the aisle here, because I'm an avid learner. I like meeting people, especially like having friendships that last a long time. If that's the kind of friend that I want in my life, or people that I want in my life, not just in the short term but for the duration, as far as my friends go, and things like that. And so I'd say that vintage people are definitely something to talk about, I guess, when it concerns old stuff or vintage stuff. We didn't even talk about vintage furniture, which is, by the way, a million times better than like IKEA stuff. And not to bag on IKEA, because they have a really good food court. I'd say I've only Main Event is the best food court of the two, but that's just my opinion. Probably another video talk time. So until our Saturday inaugural mukbang, which will happen here in just a little while with Elote, I will, till that time, hope that you guys have a wonderful afternoon.